Morgan Heist is Norristown's first dive at the Norristown Cheltenham diving meet. Morgan is going to be doing a back dive in the layout position. Scores of 4, 4, and 4. Amy of Cheltenham will be diving a back dive in the layout position as her first dive. Scores of 4, 4, and 4. Beverly Pate of Norristown High School will also be diving a 201A, which is a back dive in the layout position. Beverly scores are 4.5, 4.5, and 4.5. Gabby Berry of Norristown is next. She's also diving a 201A, a back dive in the layout position. That was very well done by Gabby. Scores are unanimous at 5.5. Greg from Norristown is up next. He's the first male diver. Greg's dive was a back dive in layout position with scores of 4.5, 5, and 5. Steve from Cheltenham is up next. He also dove a back dive in layout position. His scores were 4.5, 5, and 5. Connor Tomlinson from Norristown is also going to be doing a back dive in the layout position. That was a very good dive. Scores of 5.5, 6, and 6. Roxford from Cheltenham will also be doing a back dive in layout position. His scores are 5, 5, and 5.5. Brian Gorman from Norristown is doing a back dive with 1 somersault, meaning he'll land on his feet for his first dive. That was very well executed by Brian. A back somersault in the layout position. Scores of 5.5, 5, and 5.5. Casey from Cheltenham will also be doing a back dive in the layout position. Scores of 5, 4.5, and 5.5. The reason that many of the divers chose to do a back dive in the layout position for their first dive is because each week in diving competitions there's a required dive. This week it happens to be back dives. Each diver is required to do one back dive. However, for the remainder of their rounds, they have mostly their own choice of which dive to use. Morgan Heist of Norristown did a back somersault in the tuck position with scores of 5, 4.5, and 5. Amy from Cheltenham will be doing an inward dive in the tuck position. The difference between an inward dive and a backward dive is that when standing on the edge of the board for a back dive, divers lean back to complete their dive. On an inward dive, they lean forward towards the board to complete the dive. Scores of 5, 5, and 5. Beverly will also be doing a back somersault in the tuck position. Her scores were 3.5, 3, and 4. Her scores were a little bit lower because she didn't completely curl up into the tuck position and because she did go a little bit far away from the board on the dive. Gabby of Norristown will be diving an inward dive in the tuck position. That was very well done by Gabby. Scores are unanimous at 5.5. Greg from Norristown will also be doing a back somersault in the tuck position. Unfortunately, Greg went a little bit over on that dive. He rotated a little bit too far, so that'll pull down his scores a little bit. Scores of 2.5, 3, and 3. Steve from Cheltenham will be doing an inward dive in the tuck position. Steve's dive was a little bit close to the board, so that'll affect his scores as well. Scores of 4, 4, and 4.5. Connor Tomlinson will be doing a back dive 1 and 1/2 somersaults in the tuck position. Conrad's scores were unanimous at 4.5. Roxford from Cheltenham will be diving a 202A, which is a back somersault in the layout position. That was very well done. The scores are 5.5, 5, and 5. Brian Gorman of Norristown will be diving an inward dive, 1 1/2 somersaults in the tuck position. That was well done by Brian. Scores of 5, 4.5, and 5.5. Casey from Cheltenham will be diving a reverse dive in the tuck position. His scores were unanimous at 3.5. Morgan will be doing an inward dive in the tuck position. That was a very good dive for Morgan. Scores of 4.5, 5.5, and 5.5. Morgan's very pleased with that dive. Amy from Cheltenham will be doing the first twister of the day, a 5111A, which is a forward dive with 1/2 twist in the layout position. Amy broke layout position a little bit. It turned a little bit into a pike, and that'll affect her scores, which were 3.5, 3.5, and 4. Beverly from Norristown is doing an inward dive in a tuck position. That's a good job by Beverly. Scores of 4, 4.5, and 5. Gabby from Norristown is doing an inward somersault in the tuck position. Scores of 5.5, 5, and 5. Greg will also be doing an inward dive, an inward somersault in the tuck position. Unfortunately, that was a failed dive. This is because his feet did not enter the water first. Steve also did an inward dive, an inward somersault in the tuck position, but he was extremely close to the board, and that will certainly affect his scores. Scores of 4, 4, and 4. The judges are having a brief conference. Connor Tomlinson is up. He'll be doing a front dive, 1 1/2 somersaults in the tuck position. Connor achieved a lot of height, which meant he was able to straighten that dive out before he put it in the water. Scores of 5, 5, and 4 1/2. Well done. Roxford will be diving an inward dive in the tuck position. His scores were all the same at 5. Brian Gorman of Norristown is diving a front dive, 1 1/2 somersaults in the pike position. There are 4 different positions in diving which you can do your dive from. The first is layout, which is completely straight, no angles or bends in your body. The second is pike, where you're bent at the waist with legs straight. The third is tuck, where you're curled up into a ball. And the fourth is free, which is usually used during a twisting dive when there's no clear definition of your position. That was very well done by Brian, with scores of 6, 6, and 6. Casey dove an inward somersault in the tuck position. Scores of 5, 4 1/2, and 5 1/2. That was very well done as well. Morgan dove a front dive, 1 1/2 somersaults in the tuck position, with scores of 4, 5, and 4 1/2. Amy from Cheltenham is diving a 101C, a forward dive in the tuck position. And the judges are going to discuss whether or not this was a legal dive. Amy over-rotated on her dive, and so they're discussing whether or not they will score it. Her scores were 2, 2, and 2, which means she does get credit for completing the dive, as opposed to failing the dive, which she gets no scores for. Beverly completed an excellent reverse dive in the tuck position. It was very well done, with scores of 6, 6, and 6.5. Good job, Beverly.